3 minutes and 47 seconds. That's how long the exercise lasted before the American command post went dark. Not from a simulated artillery strike, not from electronic warfare. From 4 British commandos who had walked through the front door wearing uniforms they'd purchased from the base exchange for less than $40. They sat down in the briefing room, listened to the operational plan for the next 48 hours, memorized the coordinates, the frequencies, and the axis of advance, walked back out, and relayed every detail to the Allied force waiting in the desert. The American colonel running the exercise discovered the breach 6 hours later, only when the British used the exact frequencies and call signs from that briefing to issue false orders that sent an entire U.S. Marine battalion driving into a prepared ambush in a canyon 12 kilometers east of its intended objective. The senior American observer controller, stationed at the Tactical Operations Center, typed a single sentence into the exercise log that would circulate through military channels on both sides of the Atlantic for months afterward. Allied force has achieved total information dominance through methods not addressed in any current U.S. defensive protocol. That wasn't a war. It wasn't a battle. It was a training exercise in the Mojave Desert. And it broke something inside the confidence of one of the most formidable fighting forces on the planet. The year was 2021. The location was the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms, California, a sprawling expanse of sun-scorched rock and sand covering roughly 930 square miles, an area approximately the size of Luxembourg. It is one of the largest military training facilities on Earth, purpose-built for the United States Marine Corps to test its combat units under conditions as close to real warfare as peacetime allows. The base contains 3 fully constructed urban training complexes, the largest comprising over 1,200 purpose-built buildings designed to simulate the dense, chaotic architecture of Middle Eastern and North African cities. It has ranges capable of supporting live fire from everything up to artillery and close air support. It has instrumented tracking systems that record every movement, every engagement, every simulated casualty with forensic precision. 29 Palms is where the Marine Corps sends its battalions before they deploy to the most dangerous places on Earth. It is the final exam. And for decades, the units that came through those gates operated with the unspoken assumption that no visiting Allied force would ever fundamentally challenge the way the United States Marine Corps fights a war. That assumption survived until a group of British Royal Marines from 40 Commando, Taunton, Somerset, stepped off their transport and began unpacking equipment that their American hosts would later describe as almost offensively minimal. Exercise Green Dagger was the formal designation. It was structured as a multinational training event, bringing together forces from the United Kingdom, Canada, the Netherlands, and the United Arab Emirates to operate alongside and against elements of the U.S. Marine Corps in a free-play warfighting scenario. Free play meant there was no script, no predetermined winner. Both sides were given objectives, resources, and terrain, and told to fight. The Allied force, built around the Royal Marines' newly formed Littoral Response Group South, would act as the defending force, holding 3 urban complexes against a U.S. Marine regiment acting as the attacking enemy. The exercise would run for 5 days and 5 nights across the full breadth of the 29 Palms training area. The Americans brought what they always brought: a full Marine regiment augmented with armor, artillery, aviation assets, electronic warfare capability, and the institutional confidence of an organization that had been grinding through these desert exercises for more than 3 decades. They knew the terrain. They knew the ranges. They knew the urban layouts the way a homeowner knows the rooms of his own house. The British brought something different entirely. To understand what the Royal Marines carried into that desert, you have to understand what they had been building for the previous 3 years. Beginning in 2018, the Royal Marines had embarked on a radical transformation of their force structure under the direction of the Commandant General Royal Marines and endorsed by the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Tony Ratican. The concept was called the Future Commando Force, and its central premise was deceptively simple. In a world where precision-guided munitions, surveillance drones, and satellite intelligence had made large, concentrated military formations increasingly vulnerable, the most survivable and lethal force would be one that was small, dispersed, highly mobile and capable of striking with disproportionate effect from unexpected directions. The future commando force restructured Royal Marine commando units away from the traditional battalion model of massed infantry organized into rifle companies, and instead created smaller, more autonomous teams of commandos equipped with enhanced communications, organic drone capability, advanced surveillance sensors, and the authority to make tactical decisions at the lowest possible level. Where a conventional battalion concentrated its combat power in formations of hundreds, the future commando force dispersed it into teams of dozens, spread across vast areas, networked together electronically but physically separated by kilometers of terrain. Each team was designed to be self-sufficient for extended periods. Each team was trained to operate independently, making decisions without waiting for orders from a distant headquarters. The concept drew directly from the SAS model of small team autonomy, but applied it at commando unit scale, creating a formation that could cover the operational area of a conventional brigade while presenting no target larger than a platoon for an enemy to concentrate against. Exercise Green Dagger was the first major test of this concept against a peer adversary in a realistic combat environment. The Royal Marines did not arrive at 29 Palms expecting to simply participate. They arrived expecting to prove that everything they had been building actually worked. The first indication that this exercise would be different came during the initial planning phase. The Royal Marines' approach to intelligence gathering departed from every assumption the American exercise controllers had built into their scenario design. Standard procedure at 29 Palms was for the opposing force to rely primarily on the intelligence picture provided by the exercise framework, supplemented by their own organic reconnaissance assets, such as scout teams and unmanned aerial systems. The British treated the intelligence problem as if it were an actual combat deployment, which meant they treated every available source of information as fair game. Commando teams from 30 Commando Information Exploitation Group, the Royal Marines' dedicated intelligence and electronic warfare unit, deployed their specialists across the training area with equipment designed to intercept, monitor, and exploit the electromagnetic spectrum. They listened to American radio traffic. They tracked the electronic signatures of American command vehicles. They mapped the patterns of American movement using commercial off-the-shelf tracking devices that they had purchased from civilian retailers and attached to American vehicles during the preparatory phase of the exercise when both forces were sharing the same base facilities and American security protocols did not anticipate that an Allied force would conduct intelligence operations against them before the exercise had formally begun. This was not cheating. This was precisely the kind of unconventional thinking that free play exercises are designed to encourage. But it was a shock to American units that had spent years training against opponents who played by the expected rules. The most discussed incident, the one that would generate headlines across British media and uncomfortable silence in American military circles, involved what multiple sources described as a penetration of the American headquarters. According to accounts gathered by Marine Major Tom Schumann, a former infantry commander who surveyed participants after the exercise, British personnel allegedly purchased U.S. Marine uniforms from the post exchange on the 29 Palms base and used them to gain physical access to the American command post. Whether this specific incident occurred during Green Dagger 2021 or a related exercise remains contested among participants. But the broader pattern was unmistakable. The British approached the exercise with a philosophy that treated information warfare, deception, and unconventional methods not as supplements to conventional combat, but as primary weapons. When the 5-day warfighting phase began, the effects of this intelligence advantage became immediately apparent. The Allied force, with the Royal Marines at its core and supported by Dutch 12 Raiding Squadron of the Netherlands Marine Corps, Canadian forces, Emirati troops, and American MARSOC elements, knew where the American units were. They knew where they were going, and they knew when they were coming. The information asymmetry was total before the first shot had been fired. The Royal Marines employed their dispersed commando teams to conduct raids deep behind American lines, striking command posts, logistics nodes, and artillery positions with small, fast-moving groups that appeared from unexpected directions and vanished before a response could be organized. These were not conventional infantry assaults. They were commando operations in the truest sense of the word. Teams of a dozen or fewer men moving at night across open desert, navigating by terrain features and GPS to positions that the Americans had not bothered to defend because no previous opposing force had ever reached them. They used their organic drone capability to maintain persistent surveillance over American movement corridors, feeding real-time targeting data to commando teams positioned along the routes. They coordinated fires from 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery with a precision that repeatedly caught American units in the open during vulnerable moments of transition between positions, the most dangerous moment for any military formation and the moment a well-prepared enemy exploits with maximum violence. The combat engineers from 24 Commando Royal Engineers integrated with the assault teams, providing breaching capability and obstacle construction that channeled American armored vehicles into kill zones prepared hours in advance. The Air Defense Troop from 30 Commando conducted live firing exercises with surface-to-air systems that, in the context of the exercise, denied the Americans the air superiority they had assumed would be guaranteed. Every element of 3 Commando Brigade had been woven together into a single, cohesive fighting organism that was far greater than the sum of its constituent parts. The effect was devastating. According to the Royal Navy's official account of the exercise, the Allied force won decisive battles early in the engagement and gained significant ground. When the Americans attempted to counterattack, pushing forces back into Allied-held territory, British commandos conducted raids behind the American lines that severed supply routes and destroyed simulated command and control infrastructure. The American counterattack stalled. According to multiple British media reports citing participants in the exercise, the American force suffered such severe simulated casualties in the early days that exercise controllers regenerated, destroyed American units, effectively resetting them to allow the exercise to continue for its full 5-day duration. By the time the final American assault was launched on the last day, it was repelled. The Allied force held control of more than 2/3 of the entire battlefield. The Royal Marines' simulated kill board, the running tally of enemy equipment and personnel assessed as destroyed, reportedly had a mark against nearly every major American asset in the exercise. Lieutenant Colonel Andy Dow, commanding officer of 40 Commando, offered a measured but unmistakable assessment. The new commando force concept, he said, had proved itself more lethal and sophisticated than ever before. He spoke of delivering disproportionate effect against a free-thinking peer adversary. The language was diplomatic. The results were not. The U.S. Marine Corps responded with characteristic institutional discipline. A spokesperson stated that winners are never determined in such exercises, that the purpose was to heighten unit performance and increase readiness, and that the exercise did not provide an opportunity to surrender, keep score, or reset. This was technically accurate. Training exercises at 29 Palms are designed to stress units, identify weaknesses, and generate learning points. The entire purpose is to lose in training so you win in combat. The U.S. Marine Corps also took to social media to express appreciation for the British participation. U.S. Marines are fortunate to train with allies and partners all over the world every day, including our brothers and sisters in the Royal Marines, the service wrote. As fellow soldiers of the sea, we have a unique and proven bond shared by those who have earned the title of Marine. Tough, realistic training with foreign partners allows us to sharpen our skills, validate our techniques, and learn new tactics. Iron sharpens iron. The language was generous, professional, and entirely characteristic of a military organization that understood the value of what had just occurred, even if the headlines made for uncomfortable reading. But behind the official statements, a more candid conversation was taking place. American Marines who participated acknowledged that the exercise had been, in the words of one battalion-level leader who communicated with Major Schumann afterward, a humbling experience. The British had done things the Americans had not anticipated. They had operated in ways that exposed assumptions the Marine Corps did not know it was making. They had demonstrated that a smaller, lighter, more dispersed force, operating with superior intelligence and the willingness to employ unconventional methods, could systematically dismantle a larger, heavier, more conventionally organized opponent. This was not the first time British forces had produced this kind of result against American counterparts in a training environment. The dynamic had deeper roots, stretching back decades through joint exercises and exchange programs that had repeatedly demonstrated a fundamental philosophical difference between how the two nations prepared their soldiers for war. The pattern was consistent enough to constitute a tradition. In Norway, during NATO winter warfare exercises, British Royal Marine Commandos operating in Arctic conditions routinely demonstrated levels of cold weather endurance and tactical mobility that impressed Scandinavian allies who had grown up in those environments and left American participants questioning their own cold weather doctrine. In the jungles of Brunei and Belize, British forces conducting jungle warfare training alongside American units consistently demonstrated patrol craft, concealment techniques, and ambush methodology that reflected decades of accumulated experience stretching back to the Malayan emergency of the 1950s. In urban warfare exercises across Europe, British units demonstrated a fluency with close-quarters battle drills and population-centric operations that had been refined through 30 years of continuous deployment in Northern Ireland. Experience that no American unit could match because no American unit had endured a comparable operational commitment of that duration and intensity in a similar environment. The relationship between American and British Special Operations Forces is one of the most consequential military partnerships in modern history. And it began with a single American officer who was so transformed by what he witnessed serving alongside the British that he spent the rest of his career trying to replicate it. In 1962, Captain Charlie Beckwith of the U.S. Army Special Forces was sent to the United Kingdom as an exchange officer with the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. He deployed with the SAS to Malaya during the confrontation with Indonesia, operating in dense jungle alongside British operators whose approach to warfare was unlike anything he had encountered in the American military. Beckwith had been trained in unconventional warfare at Fort Bragg. He considered himself and his fellow Green Berets to be among the finest soldiers in the world. What he found in the SAS shattered that assumption. The SAS operated in four-man patrols that spent weeks at a time deep in the jungle, completely self-sufficient, gathering intelligence, building relationships with indigenous populations, and engaging the enemy with a precision and patience that Beckwith had never seen. They navigated without electronic aids. They communicated by high-frequency radio in brief coded bursts designed to be undetectable. They made tactical decisions at the lowest level, with individual patrol commanders exercising an authority that in the American system would have required approval from officers several ranks above. Beckwith was so deeply embedded with the regiment that he contracted a severe case of leptospirosis in the jungle, an infection that can cause kidney failure and pulmonary hemorrhaging. His case was so extreme that doctors gave him 3 weeks to live. He survived because Charlie Beckwith was not a man who accepted other people's assessments of what was possible. Beckwith returned to the United States convinced that the American military lacked a unit capable of the kind of direct action and covert operations the SAS conducted as routine. He wrote a detailed report recommending the creation of an SAS-type unit within the U.S. Army. His superiors filed it away and forgot about it. For over a decade, Beckwith pushed, argued, and resubmitted his proposal to anyone who would listen. The Army establishment resisted. Special Forces leadership saw no need for a new unit. The bureaucracy ground on. It was not until the mid-1970s when the rising threat of international terrorism finally forced the Pentagon to acknowledge the gap Beckwith had identified that he was authorized to create the unit he had been advocating for since his return from Malaya. On the 19th of November, 1977, the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta was formally established at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Delta Force, modeled directly on the British SAS. Its selection process, its organizational structure, its operational philosophy, all drawn from the regiment Beckwith had served with 15 years earlier. The irony was profound. America's premier counterterrorism unit, the force that would eventually become the most lavishly funded and technologically advanced special operations organization in human history, was a copy of a British original. And the original had been built on principles that were, in many ways, the opposite of the American approach to military power. The SAS was founded on the belief that the individual operator was the primary weapon system. Everything else, equipment, technology, logistics, existed to support the man. The American system, driven by industrial capacity, technological innovation, and budgets that dwarfed anything the British could match, evolved in the opposite direction. The equipment became the primary system, and the operator existed to employ it. This philosophical divide produced two forces that were both extraordinarily capable, but optimized for different kinds of warfare. When they trained together, the differences were impossible to ignore. The SAS selection process, conducted twice yearly from the regiment's base at Hereford, begins with a phase known simply as the Hills. Candidates from across the British Army report to the training wing and are transported to the Brecon Beacons in South Wales, a range of mountains that rises to 886 meters at its highest point, Pen y Fan. The terrain is exposed, boggy, wind-scoured, and subject to weather that oscillates between driving rain and near-zero visibility fog without warning. For 4 weeks, candidates march alone across this landscape, carrying rucksacks that increase in weight from approximately 25 kilograms to over 30 kilograms, plus weapon, water, and food. They navigate between grid references using only a map and compass. The time limits for each march are not disclosed. Candidates do not know how fast they need to move. The only strategy available is maximum effort on every single leg, because any checkpoint could be the one that determines pass or fail. The culminating event is a march known as endurance, sometimes called the long drag. It covers 64 kilometers across the full width of the Brecon Beacons, carrying the full load, to be completed in under 20 hours. Alone, in whatever weather the mountains deliver that day. Since 1960, at least 5 candidates have died during SAS selection marches. The pass rate for the entire course hovers between 10 and 15%. What this process produces is not merely physical fitness. Physical fitness is a prerequisite. What it produces is a human being who can navigate across any terrain, in any conditions, with minimal equipment, and arrive at a precise point on the Earth's surface using nothing but a paper map, a compass, and skills that have been trained to the level of instinct. It produces a man who has confronted absolute solitude under extreme physical stress and discovered that he can function when every signal his body sends is telling him to stop. Delta Force's selection, conducted at what is now Fort Liberty, North Carolina, is equally demanding physically. Candidates endure a similar series of progressively harder navigation exercises over mountainous terrain with increasing loads. The final event, colloquially known as the Long Walk, covers 40 miles with a 45-pound rucksack over rough ground in an undisclosed time limit. The mental testing that follows is intense, with candidates facing boards of psychologists and senior operators who probe every response. The pass rate is comparable to the SAS. The difference, as multiple observers from both forces have noted over the decades, lies not in the selection, but in what follows. SAS continuation training lasts approximately 14 months beyond selection and includes jungle warfare training in Brunei, combat survival and resistance to interrogation, demolitions, advanced medical training, signals, language instruction, and specialist skills in one of 4 troops: air, boat, mountain, or mobility. By the time an SAS operator is badged into the regiment, he has been in continuous training for approximately 18 months and has acquired a skill set designed to make him functionally self-sufficient in any environment on Earth without technological support. The American system, by contrast, invested heavily in the technological infrastructure that surrounded the operator. By 2005, a Delta Force operator deploying to Iraq carried equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars on his person alone. Night vision systems with thermal fusion overlay. Helmet-mounted cameras streaming live video to analysts in a joint operations center who could advise during raids in real time. Encrypted communications across multiple channels. Infrared laser designators accurate to 600 meters in total darkness. Wrist-mounted screens displaying satellite imagery. The individual operator was embedded within a technological ecosystem so sophisticated that it represented the most advanced infantry capability in human history. And it worked. Under the command of General Stanley McChrystal, the Joint Special Operations Command ran an industrial-scale targeting machine that would eventually conduct up to 12 raids per night across Iraq. The results were devastating. But the technology created dependencies. When satellite links dropped in urban Iraq, operators accustomed to overhead imagery had to revert to map reading they had not practiced in months. When encrypted radios failed in the dense concrete canyons of Iraqi cities, coordination collapsed. When helmet-mounted systems overloaded operators with simultaneous feeds of target imagery, chat messages, GPS waypoints, and radio traffic from multiple nets, decision-making slowed at exactly the moment when speed was everything. Studies later published by the RAND Corporation found that information overload in special operations was directly correlated with slower reaction times during the critical first seconds of room entry. Milliseconds that in close quarters combat determined who shot first. The British, operating alongside the Americans in Iraq under the classified designation Task Force Black, could not afford the alternative. The entire annual budget of the United Kingdom Special Forces Directorate, covering 22 SAS, the Special Boat Service, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, and all supporting elements, was estimated at approximately £250 million. The Americans were spending roughly 7 times more on special operations per operator. The result was that SAS squadrons deploying to Iraq carried equipment that their American counterparts found astonishing. Paper maps pinned to walls with colored string marking target networks. Intelligence cells of 4 people compared to the 300-plus analysts in the American Fusion Center at Balad. Vehicles that looked like they had been dragged through every conflict since the First Gulf War, because most of them had. Their planning room at their primary base in Baghdad contained paper maps, printed satellite imagery pinned to corkboards, and a whiteboard. A former Delta operator who visited the SAS compound recalled walking in and seeing colored string stretched between pins on a wall map like something from a Second World War movie, while the Americans had a $40 million intelligence fusion cell operating next door. 4 people versus 300. And the SAS was outperforming the numbers. And yet, during the most intense period of operations in Baghdad, the SAS consistently achieved a higher rate of what the intelligence community called jackpots, meaning the intended target was actually present when the assault force hit the building. The SAS jackpot rate hovered around 72%. The American rate during the same period was approximately 48%. The British were hitting fewer targets, but when they hit, the target was home nearly 3/4 of the time. The reason was simple in concept and extraordinarily difficult in execution. The SAS approached targets on foot, in civilian vehicles, wearing local clothing, moving through the city with a level of concealment that made them functionally invisible. Their compromise rate, the percentage of operations where the assault force was detected before reaching the target, was below 8%. The American rate in the same operational environment, using armored vehicles, helicopter overwatch, and electronic warfare suites that broadcast their presence across the electromagnetic spectrum, was between 35 and 45%. Being unseen was worth more than being unstoppable. This same principle was what the Royal Marines brought to the Mojave Desert in 2021, translated from the special operations world into a conventional force structure. The future commando force was not simply a reorganization of existing units. It was an attempt to embed the philosophy that had made the SAS effective: small teams, minimal signatures, maximum autonomy, unconventional thinking, into a larger commando formation capable of operating at scale. At 29 Palms, that philosophy collided with the American way of war. The U.S. Marines fought the exercise the way they had been trained to fight, with concentrated combat power, heavy armor, integrated combined arms, and the assumption that overwhelming force applied at decisive points would break any defense. It was a methodology that had won wars. It was a methodology that had been refined across decades of exercises on this very ground. The British did not try to match it. They refused to fight on American terms. They dispersed, they hid, they listened, they struck from directions the Americans were not watching because no previous opposing force had ever thought to attack from there. They treated information as a weapon system, equal to any gun or missile. They exploited every seam in the American approach, every assumption that had hardened into doctrine through repetition, every habit that had become invisible through familiarity. The American Marines at 29 Palms were not incompetent. They were among the finest conventional infantry forces on Earth. They lost to whatever extent winning and losing applies in a training exercise because they were being tested by an opponent that refused to play the game they had spent decades mastering. The broader lesson, the one that resonated through military circles on both sides of the Atlantic in the months that followed, was not that the British were better. It was that the British were different. And the difference exposed something that the American military, for all its enormous capability, had not adequately addressed. The assumption that superiority in technology, numbers, and firepower would always translate into superiority in outcome. The Royal Marines had demonstrated in the most unambiguous possible terms that a smaller force operating with better intelligence, greater dispersion, higher individual initiative, and a willingness to think outside the boundaries of conventional doctrine could defeat a larger, heavier, more technologically advanced opponent on that opponent's home ground. This was not a new lesson. The SAS had been teaching it since David Stirling first sketched his concept for a small unit of exceptional individuals on a hospital bed in Cairo in 1941. It had been demonstrated in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Malaya, the mountains of Oman, the streets of Belfast, and the alleys of Baghdad. What Green Dagger 2021 proved was that the principle extended beyond special operations. It applied to conventional forces. It applied at scale. It applied even when the opposing force was the United States Marine Corps, operating on terrain it had trained on for 30 years. The U.S. Marine Corps, to its enduring credit, responded not with denial, but with adaptation. The exercise generated learning points that were incorporated into subsequent training cycles. The vulnerabilities that had been exposed in information security, in assumptions about enemy behavior, in the limitations of conventional force structures against dispersed agile opponents were studied, discussed, and addressed. That is what training exercises are for. That is why the Marine Corps invites Allied forces to 29 Palms. Not to validate existing doctrine, but to break it against ideas they have not encountered, so that when a real enemy attempts the same thing, the doctrine has already been rebuilt. But the moment itself, the moment when a handful of British commandos walked through an American headquarters wearing purchased uniforms and walked out carrying the operational plan for the next 2 days, that moment captured something that no amount of institutional learning could entirely smooth over. It captured the essence of a military culture that had spent centuries learning how to win wars with less. Less money, less equipment, less manpower. And the compensating investment in the one resource that no budget could outbid, the individual, the commando who could think around corners, the operator who could navigate without satellites, the sergeant who could look at a problem that a 1,000-page doctrine manual had not anticipated and improvise a solution from whatever he had in his pockets. The Americans built the most powerful military machine in human history. The British built the people who could walk through its front door and take its plans off the table. Stop sending the British, someone reportedly said after the exercise results circulated. They're making us look bad. Nobody stopped sending them. Because the uncomfortable truth, the truth that Charlie Beckwith recognized in the jungles of Malaya in 1962 and that American commanders rediscovered in the Mojave Desert in 2021, is that the British don't make anyone look bad. They make everyone look harder at what they might be missing. They hold up a mirror that shows not weakness, but assumption, not failure, but complacency. And in military affairs, where the penalty for complacency is measured in lives, that mirror is worth more than any weapon system ever built. 40 Commando went home to Taunton. The U.S. Marines went back to preparing for the next deployment. The desert at 29 Palms returned to silence, waiting for the next exercise, the next test, the next time someone would try something nobody expected. The lesson stood. It stands still. You can spend billions on the finest equipment ever manufactured. You can train in the most advanced facilities ever constructed. You can deploy the most powerful military force the world has ever seen. Or you can invest in the kind of soldier who walks into the enemy's headquarters with a $40 uniform and walks out with everything he needs to win the war. The British have been making that investment for centuries. And every few years, in a desert or a jungle or a frozen mountain range, someone on the other side of the exercise discovers what that investment produces. Not superiority. Something more unsettling than that. Ingenuity, audacity, and the absolute, bone-deep refusal to be outthought by anyone, regardless of how much money they spent trying. The Royal Marines who deployed to 29 Palms in 2021 were not special forces. They were conventional commandos. They were the sons of plumbers, teachers, factory workers, and shopkeepers from towns across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They had earned the Green Beret through 32 weeks of commando training at the Commando Training Center Royal Marines in Lympstone, Devon, one of the longest and most physically demanding initial military training courses in NATO. They had learned to fight in the mud and rain of Dartmoor, the frozen fjords of Norway, and the jungles of Brunei. They had been taught from their very first day of service that the commando spirit, the qualities of courage, determination, unselfishness, and cheerfulness in the face of adversity mattered more than any piece of equipment they would ever carry. That spirit, cultivated across generations of Royal Marines from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of the Falklands to the compounds of Helmand Province, was what walked into the Mojave Desert and dismantled a force that outweighed it in every measurable category except one: the willingness to think differently, the capacity to look at a problem that everyone else had been solving the same way for decades and ask a simple, devastating question. What if we didn't do it that way? That is what walked into 29 Palms in October 2021. That is what walked out holding 2/3 of the battlefield. And that is why, somewhere in the exercise logs of the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, there exists a sentiment that nobody who encountered it has ever been able to forget. Stop sending the British. They're making us look bad. They sent them anyway. And the British did exactly what they have always done. They adapted, they improvised, they refused to fight fair, and they won. Not with money, not with machines, with men. That is the tradition. That is the legacy, and that is why you never under any circumstances bet against the British.